Hey, everybody, this is Eric Mishi, SAVE Executive Director, and I am thrilled to be here today with another partner of SAVE's. It's also a member of the National Council for Suicide Prevention, Casey Starr with Samaritans New York City. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. And Casey is the co-executive director, and I'm excited to have this conversation to learn more and also to be able to share more with the community that we work with, Casey, about what is your organization, what do you do, and learn more about it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having us here. We're really excited to share, and it's always great to be able to do things with our partners on the National Council. So thank you again for hosting this. We are from Samaritans, which is, I represent Samaritans both New York City, Samaritans USA, and also Befrienders Worldwide. So Samaritans was actually started in 1953 in the UK, which maybe not is it's not our first association with mental health openness. But it's funny because I studied in the UK, which is really where I found out about Samaritans. And when I first moved there, everybody there asks you when you meet them, "You okay? You okay?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, everyone here really cares about how I'm feeling." And I would be like, "Actually, no, I'm kind of having a hard day," or, "Yeah, I'm great. I'm really excited about this." And everyone would give me this weird look. And it took a while for me to realize they're not asking me, "Are you okay?" It's just how they say, "How are you?"
Yeah.
Um, but that coupled with learning about Samaritans, really for me, I don't have that association of mental health stigma that a lot of people do at the UK. Um, so in the 50s, there was a pastor, his name was Chad Vera, and he had been counseling people in his offices, and he would bring people in to talk. And he found that there were more people that he had to talk to, so there would be kind of a wait. And in the waiting room, he would have church volunteers and his secretary talking with them. And he found that by the time they had come into his office for the counseling, a lot of their intensity of their experiences, their upset, their distress had dissipated.
Hmm.
And he got the idea of starting a phone hotline that, we could do this kind of work talking on the phone, and that actually volunteers could do this work, lay volunteers. Chad Vera was a clinician as well as a pastor, but he saw that there was a power in just everyday people doing what we call at Samaritans befriending, which is the philosophy that guides all of the work we do. And it's a non-judgmental emotional support process that focuses on empathetic listening. And what Chad Vera saw in the 50s has been borne out in all of the research that well-trained volunteers can do this work and can do it well. And so it's the mission of all Samaritans branches in the world. And there are, I think last year we had 193 countries doing these services with lay volunteers providing support in their communities, can do this well. And so that's really how we were started. And although we're started by a pastor and Samaritans is our name, we're part of Befrienders Worldwide because that's a Western concept. And really, it's a name by accident. It was an article in the 50s in the Daily Mirror saying, "Call a good Samaritan," and people just couldn't get that out of their head. And so we are non-religious, non-political suicide prevention network operating across the world.
And so it's interesting because, we think today in the context of, uh, how do we support one another? How do we help one another? And particularly kind of coming out of a global pandemic and this idea of that word befriending, right? And kind of actively the active effort of reaching out and trying to support someone and to befriend them, right? And so, how does that translate then into practical terms in terms of the work that you do?
Absolutely. So I think the practical benefit of befriending is that it has a couple core tenets. And one is that basically we are not the expert in someone else's life. The other person is. And so we very much embrace self-determination for people, which in suicide prevention, empowerment, self-efficacy, these are really important clinical constructs that really make a difference when we're talking about whether or not someone is able to cope with the degree of ideation they're having and waiting out those impulses. And so that is a core aspect of what we do. And the other piece that I would say is that we don't solve people's problems. Um, in every training class, we start training and we say, you don't solve other people's problems for them. It's hard enough to handle your own. You
Mhm.
don't save another person's life. You help them get through a moment, this moment now. And that's the work we do. And by framing it that way, it's a lot of pressure to feel like you're talking to someone who you think might be suicidal, and all of a sudden, the responsibility for their life is on you. That's a lot of pressure, whether you're a layperson or a PhD or a clinical psychologist or a psych. I don't care who you are. I have not
Yep.
talked to someone who doesn't feel that as intense. But the reality is, we don't save people's lives. People they save themselves. They're responsible for themselves. We help them get through the moment. If you're afraid of the dark, it's better to be sitting holding someone's hand than sitting alone. I can't stop it from getting dark. The sun will set every day, but I can be there. And that's the work we do. It's not about fixing, it's not about having the right thing to say. I mean, I don't think there is a right thing to say. And when on the hotline, when someone calls us and they're dealing with trauma and whatever it is, when they get off the phone, they're still dealing with that same experience. We can't take that away. And so we really encourage people to abandon that idea of problem solving and to focus on connection. And that is, where we get people get their stuff out. There's a little bit of pressure release. And then we keep going. And for some people, they need that pressure release 1, 2, 3 times a day. Every day they're dealing with that. And for others, it's just a short period of time. And the final thing I would say is that we would say that, suicide touches people of every age, every race, every background, every socioeconomic class, every culture, ethnicity. It kind of proves how we're the same.
Mhm.
We all can battle this, and therefore it's not something that happens to others. And our big push right now is to say suicide prevention starts with me, whether I'm dealing with it or not, whether it's my personal issue, someone in my family, a friend or not, it's me. And so taking that approach is really important from our
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, and that's it's interesting again that description of how you approach that because the if you share with people that your job is you're not there to save somebody's life, right? Particularly if you're a volunteer. That you're exactly right. That's a lot of pressure to put on somebody. So as we talk more and more about crises text line, we talk about 988. So how does all of that fit in with what it is you do in New York City with your hotline?
Absolutely. So we run a 24-hour suicide prevention crisis hotline, and we see ourselves as a complement to 988. Um, One of the things that kind of distinguishes Samaritans and Befrienders Worldwide and Samaritans kind of as an international organization and the US model is we kind of deviate on the interventionist aspect of it. So we are non interventionist, and a lot of the US model is interventionist. And that's not a comment on whether one is right or wrong or better or worse. In fact, in the US, we have some Samaritans branches that are even in the 988 network. So we see it as responding to the needs of the community we're in. So in a lot of places in the world, people don't want to talk on the phone because they don't have privacy in their homes. And so they have drop-in centers. In New York, we're phone-based. So we really adapt to that. And in New York, we serve a population that has a lot of resistance or hesitancy in engaging with government-run or formal clinical services. Maybe they've been hospitalized before and they don't want that again, or they're worried about that again. We have a lot of people who are concerned about immigration status. We have a big migrant situation. I won't say crisis. I think a lot of the language that's used now around mental health and suicide and everything is epidemic and crisis. And yes, they're concerning, but I think that creates it as a much less addressable issue than it really is. I think we have a management crisis, perhaps, in how we approach issues, but I don't know that I would use that language. But we have people who are concerned about doing that. We have people who, you know, work in armed forces, maybe for police, who, if they go to their superiors and they report ideation or they call a hotline where they think there may be some sort of intervention, that they're going to lose their, get desk duty. And so that's not to say that 988 isn't an incredible service. I want to be very clear. It's a milestone in our field. We are wholly supportive of 988, and we are so proud to live in a country that has done this. Um, at the same time, we know that people access help not in the way we want them to, but in the way that they're comfortable. And right now, there's still a need for completely anonymous and confidential support, and that's what we offer. So we deliberately use quite antiquated technology to prevent us from being able to know where a call is coming from, to ensure anonymity, to ensure confidentiality. Because the last thing we want is someone to call a hotline and not be able to talk about feeling suicidal, honestly, because they're scared of essentially a stigma impact. And that's our role in New York in terms of the hotline. We also run bereavement support services for those who have lost loved ones to suicide, which includes support groups, events, just a great community. We do a lot of suicide prevention education, and we adapt our model. A lot of the education that we run into is pretty cookie cutter because it has to um, apply to as many people as possible. It's a funding base. We have to be economical in how we do this. But what we do is we go into these communities and we say, okay, but what are you really hearing? And something that was interesting to me was there was a lot of concern at one point around intimate partner violence and young girls and suicide. And they were going through this checklist with girls who were from a South Asian background, and they were trying to help them identify coercive control. And the problem was that a lot of the behaviors that are spectrum based on this checklist mirrored behaviors that their parents were having. And when they were then talking to young men in this community, they saw those same behaviors as part of being a good partner. And these girls were unable to distinguish it because the tool wasn't appropriate to their culture. And so we see that a lot, that there's a lot of issues with taking assessment tools and applying them to a culture where maybe it's more difficult to ask those questions. Or maybe, the model of let's bring in a family system and let's put them here is hard, because if I tell my parents that I'm suicidal, they're going to see it as a failure on their part.
Mhm.
And so how can we make sure that the tools we're using and the way we're training people who work in those communities are effective and really addressing those needs? And so that's one of the core aspects of our education program, is taking that cultural humility and kind of empathy informed education and combining that with these clinically validated tools so that we can be as effective as we can.
So kind of paint the picture, if you will, for folks of how does this operation look? Is there a big phone center where you've got a lot of volunteers, or how does the logistics of all of this work?
Yeah, so we do have a center office. It's a lot more comfortable than most people think. I think when people think about coming in to take a hotline call, they think about, a call center where you've got cubicles and everyone's got a headset and computers. And I'm going to tell you something. We actually have a no electronics policy in the hotline. We do not use computers on our calls. And we don't allow volunteers to be bringing in even a Kindle. We read real books in the hotline. It's really about that person to person connection. And while we can give referrals in when necessary, our focus is on talking to you as a person. And so we're not taking down tons of notes. People have pens and paper. um, we sit in it's like a very warm yellow room. It's got a kitchen, some comfortable chairs. We have desks and workstations, but it's a lot less of a call center, and it's a lot more of, I'm a person about to talk to another person who's having a tough time.
And so you're in New York City, right? You're doing this kind of as, is it a standalone from 988? Is it something? And then how do you? And I remember we had a conversation a couple of months ago, I think, with the folks that were leading the 988 Center, and you had raised a number of potential concerns about confidentiality and also about the specific populations that you were working with, right? Who they would picture themselves at potentially at risk for being able to use something like 988 or for that matter 911. So how do you coordinate that, or do you, with somebody who may be calling who you find is at some kind of immediate risk?
Absolutely. So we are independent of 988. At the same time, we can work with 988 and with local law enforcement if we need to. However, we never do anything without the consent of the caller. So one of the things that I would say is that we do get, the vast majority of our calls, as with 988, are prevention calls. Really important distinction, because prevention is getting to someone, 5, 10, even, or maybe 2 steps before they're standing on a ledge. Intervention is when they're already there. And so intervention is a function of the hotline as well. We have, protocols that allow us to respond to those calls. But very importantly is that we do not initiate, help, which in that case could be calling the police for someone or sending an ambulance or, whatever that may be, without consent. And we can't, because we don't know where they are.
Right.
They have to give us that information, or we can't provide that help. And what I'll say, is that sometimes we're on the phone with someone and we offer help and they say no. We keep talking and we offer it again and they say no. And we keep talking and we offer it again and they say yes. And I would say there's a really big difference, in terms of an emergency, between wanting to die and physically dying. That there's a distinction. There's a big difference between the immediate kind of intense moment where I can't do this anymore. And then you're on the phone with someone for an hour and a half. And now, nothing's changed in my situation, but I don't feel that intensity anymore. We know that the impulse, that intensity of suicidal ideation is going to come up like on a curve. It will wax and it will wane. And so the majority of those kinds of calls, what will happen is at some point, either it de-escalates itself, or at a certain point they're like, yeah, actually, my mom is downstairs because I'm living with her right now. I've had a setback, and I'm gonna go get her, and we're gonna go to the hospital together. We're looking. It's not just about calling 911. I think that's the other piece of it, which is that so much of suicide prevention gets to a point where it's like, okay, and now we go to the police, or now we go to the hospital. And our big question is, and then what? We as a country don't have the mental health infrastructure to support the number of people who are suffering and dealing with this in a hospital inpatient setting. And to be very clear, hospitals absolutely save lives, but that's not necessarily a trauma-informed care space.
Yeah.
And we know that suicide risk increases post-hospitalization for people who go involuntarily as well as involuntarily. So it's much more complicated than that. And again, that's not to say these aren't effective, important parts of our infrastructure. It's just that we have to be realistic about what that means and who the person is who is going into that setting. What's their background? What's their history? And again, coming back to that piece of self-determination, which we know is so important for suicide prevention, because it is the same self-determination that allows someone not to act, that
Mhm.
says, I'm not going to do this, which is that people need to make decisions for themselves, and deciding not to act on those feelings is much more effective than not being able to act on those feelings.
Right. So how do you, so as you look at the work that you're doing, Casey, and you again, the model you're using is most definitely not not necessarily that intervention model, right? And so what are, as you look at the world that you live in today and the work that you're doing, what do you see as some of the specific challenges and obstacles that you're dealing with, either as an organization or in the subject matter field, that 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 may still pose a risk that we need to be talking about so we can mitigate that?
Absolutely. I think that's a good question. The first thing I would say is that so much of suicide prevention is now inextricably linked with mental health. And there is a relationship, absolutely. But suicide prevention is much more than just mental health. And I think that there was, a huge push and an incredibly effective push to put mental health on the map as, pushing for parity between physical and mental health, that this is just part of being a person. We know that mental health conditions can impact our physical health, even just for anybody who has a moment where they think they see a spider on their shoulder and then realize that it's, just a piece of fluff, but their heart rate has increased. Like, we
Mhm.
can see that in our everyday. And so I think that that was so important. And at the same time, we're now in a situation where we're confining suicide prevention to mental health. And I see it a lot in funding. So mental health gets a lot of bipartisan support. There's a lot of funding there for that. At the same time, we would say that, we can't cope our way out. A person can't cope their way out of poverty. No amount of individual counseling, you could have the best mental health support in the world. And in New York, we have some of that. When we talk about the mental health infrastructure, we're one of the few cities in the country where we have mobile crisis units, which are, teams of social workers who go to an active crisis instead of calling the police. Like, we have that in our city. But no amount of infrastructure for mental health is going to help me put food on the table if I cannot feed my family. We cannot cope our way out of systemic racism or the impact that that's having on people. We can't cope our way out of some of these structural forces that are really affecting people's everyday lives. And at a certain point, we not only need to save lives, people need lives they feel are worth living, lives that they feel they have self efficacy and are empowered in. And when we live in systems that don't allow for that, or in some way are impinging on that, that's something that has to be addressed. And I think that for us, we want to talk about mental health, but we see like maternal health care is mental health, is suicide prevention.
Yeah.
Food pantries are suicide prevention. There are social welfare aspects of the safety net that we would say mental health is one piece of that pie. And we know when you look at trends and data that like major economic downturns coincide with increases in suicide. And we can see that economic hardships, which are not necessarily mental health, impact suicidality. Access to lethal means impacts suicide rates. These are not mental health issues, these are societal issues. And so, mental health is a huge piece of that puzzle, because just because somebody has experienced those things doesn't mean they're going to become suicidal. It's not a linear cause, and there are all these factors that then come in. At the same time, we need to work on creating a world where people have as much ability to live these lives they want to live.
It's interesting. So I'm not new to the nonprofit space. I'm not new to the kind of the uh, conversation around public health and things like that. But one of the things, Casey, that I will tell you that you talk about that, yes, we've got to talk about mental health, but we can't have that be seen as the leading cause of the suicidal ideation and suicide every single time. That's a fairly disruptive perspective, right? In this subject matter field, right? And I will say that, having been in this role now for a year in an organization that's been around for 35 years, in a subject matter space, which has probably been about the same amount of time, right? Relatively speaking. Um, this notion of having to say that not every suicidal ideation or every suicide is a result of a mental health crisis or a mental illness. And I think that is an extraordinarily important conversation to have, because to simply say that every instance of suicidal ideation and suicide, I think, is its own factor in missing the point, if you will. And from my perspective, I think the more we can have this open conversation, that there are people who have suicidal ideation simply because they have a bad day, right? People who have suicidal ideation because they've had a breakup, because they've lost a job, because they can't pay their bills, right? Those don't mean that that is an ongoing mental illness. It may be, in the context of your life, a mental health challenge, right? Because we all have mental health, right? And so it may disrupt that in that context. But I think what you're saying about needing to look beyond mental health as the sole primary factor behind suicidal ideation and suicide is extraordinarily important. It's also really disruptive.
Yeah, and I think, I agree. And it's something that, we have thought a long time about how to come out on this, because we feel very much that our role in this is person to person connection, right? That if people can be heard, if people are befriending each other, if we can share these problems, it's a little bit less of a burden on anyone. And at the same time, we have a global network where we're seeing, no matter the country, no matter where you are, these same issues coming back recurrent and recurrent and recurrent since the 1950s, when we started collecting kind of information on the impact. At a certain point, we have to say something. And in this country, when we do our training, we'll say in the beginning, who makes the most money in this country? What pop age, race, kind of, and gender? And it's, white, older males. And who has the most historical education? Same group. Historical access to opportunities? Same group. Most political power again, historically, but I would argue still now, same group. And very importantly, the most access to healthcare and mental health care, same group. And
Mm-hmm.
who dies the most by suicide? The same group. And again, it's this very, and so we make a joke, you didn't think you're coming to work on a suicide hotline to help rich investment bankers. But the reality is that that's part of it. And that's
Sure.
not to diminish anything, but to be real, that so much of this is counterintuitive. There's a lot of talk of youth suicidality, which is a huge problem and a concern. And at the same time, young people don't die by suicide at a higher rate than other causes, but young people don't tend to die of anything. And so there's that fine line between how do we talk about this to not make something, we need to address really important concerns, because there are young people dying by suicide and it is a problem. And we need to balance it with the whole perspective of what that looks like. Um, and so I think that that's something that, we really try to focus on, which is this is a human issue, and it means it impacts every aspect of what it means to be a human.
Yeah. Well said. And as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, this half hour was going to go really, really quickly. But before I let you go, as you look at the world that we're in and you look at the work that you do, and there are folks that are looking to say, what can I do to make a difference? What piece of advice, what wisdom would you impart upon them in what they can do to help somebody else?
That's a really great question. And I would say it's to listen. So it's to ask someone how they're doing and listen. It's to be like, in the UK where everyone's asking me, "You okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, am I?" But ask the follow-up question. Yeah, things are fine. Oh, you're saying things. What is going on? To listen more than you talk in the world in general, to other perspectives, to what's going on with people, to sit when you're trying to help someone, to sit in the back seat, not the front seat. You're not driving the car, you're there for companionship and for support. So sit in the dark and hold hands, but don't put all the lights on and pretend like it's not getting dark. Just being present and listening.
Extraordinarily sage advice, Casey. And I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing and the lives that you're helping and helping to impact. We appreciate the chance to amplify your work and share that work with others. And I look forward to continuing to work alongside you and collaborate to doing what we're trying to do, which is, as you said at the beginning, we're trying to help people.
Absolutely. And thank you to Save, to everything you've done, and really being this connector on the council as well. It's been wonderful.
I appreciate it. Casey, have a great day.
Take good care.
Yeah, bye-bye.